In this video, I'm going to show you how you can use a reference track to help get a professional sounding mix. It's not easy to get a track to sound truly professional. The average bedroom producer usually works in less than an ideal mixing environment. This means that you can't always trust your ears. Sure, you can use headphones in order to eliminate any problems introduced by your room, but headphones have issues on their own, so they're not ideal either. Besides experience, there are two factors that are really important in order to get good results when it comes to mixing. First, you need to know your equipment really well. Whether you use monitors or headphones, you need to know how commercial tracks tend to translate to that specific piece of gear. The second thing is a frame of reference while you're working. In other words, a reference track. But what is a reference track? A reference track is simply a professionally mixed and mastered song that you can use as a standard to measure your mix against. You may think that you're so good that you don't need anything like that, but don't be fooled. We can't always trust our own perception. That's just a fact. Have you ever made a track late at night and thought it was the best thing you've ever made? Then, the next day when you listen to it again, it sounds like crap? Yeah, I bet you have. It's the exact same thing that's going on with people on American Idol who can't sing. The thing is, they actually think that they are really good. They are fooled by their own perception. The conclusion is, you can't always trust your own perception. So a reference track is a great tool to use as a sort of quality control, if you will. When choosing a reference track, you should aim for a track that's similar to the kind of track you're making. Obviously, it should be the same genre and style of music, and preferably also in the same key, but that's not a necessity. The old school way of doing this is to simply drag a professional track into your DAW and switch between them like this. There are several problems with this method, though. The most obvious is that the professional track is already mastered, and will therefore sound fuller and louder than your unfinished mix. This is why some people argue that you should never compare your own track to a mastered reference track in this way, because it will just make your track seem worse than it really is. This is a valid argument, of course, so how do you get around this problem? It might be tempting to master your own track directly on the master bus, so that its dynamic range and volume is closer to the reference track. There's just one problem. Anything on the master will also affect the reference track, so that's not a viable option. Fortunately, there are dedicated reference plugins available now, which makes referencing a lot easier. And that's what we're going to be using today instead of the old school method. This is a plugin called Reference from Mastering the Mix. It's made specifically to make referencing as easy as possible. There are several other plugins available that do the same thing, but this one has some really cool features that I find very useful, like volume matching and the frequency analyzer. Let me show you what I mean. Here we have an unfinished track that has not been mixed properly yet. Let's check how this sounds so far compared to a commercial track. Load the reference plugin on your master bus and make sure to place it after any mastering plugins. By placing the reference plugin after your mastering plugins, you will be able to bypass the problem I mentioned earlier regarding the mastering plugins affecting the reference track. To load a reference track, just click here. You can also drag and drop them like this. You can, of course, add several reference tracks if you like. Switching between them is really easy. Just click on the one you want to hear. You can now switch back and forth between your track and the reference track. This gives you a good idea of how your own mix compares to the professional track and what changes you need to make. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is that the reference track will usually be quite a bit louder, especially if you don't have any mastering plugins on the master. This is something that I've found annoying in some other reference plugins over the years. What I like about this plugin is that it has a feature built in to deal with this problem. If you click here, it will automatically match the volume of your reference track to your own. If you have several reference tracks, you can click here to volume match all of them. The volume reduction is displayed here. We also have several metering options to choose from. Just select the one you prefer. I like to use loudness units. Now that we have the same volume, we can use the reference track and compare it to our own. How loud is the kick compared to mine? How loud is the high end, and so on. This is a great tool for getting the various levels right. It's not just beginners who use reference tracks. Professionals do it too, all the time. When you consistently analyze professional tracks methodically like this, what you're really doing is training your ears. Eventually, you won't need a reference track at all. You'll just know from experience how the mix should be. Another cool feature in this plugin is the mirror function. If you have a reference track with a similar structure to your own, you might want to use the mirror function. When you skip to the various places in your own mix, you'll always find yourself at the same point in time in the reference track. Quite useful indeed. You can of course loop a section if you prefer to do that instead. Another thing that I like is the built-in frequency analyzer down here. This will give you an indication of how much perceived loudness there is on your track compared to the reference track, as indicated by this white line here. There are different bands and they all operate independently from each other. You can also create or delete a band by holding Control and clicking. The horizontal line seen here is the stereo spread, giving you an indication as to how wide your mix is compared to the reference track. I'm not quite sure how this algorithm works, but it seems to operate in a similar way as the tonal balance control in Ozone 8, except that this one only gives you a comparison based on the reference track you've loaded. The pink lines you see here represent the dynamics. If they move towards the white line, that means this band in your track is more compressed than the reference track. If they move away from it, then it's more dynamic. This feature is useful in several different ways. For example, the low end is something that a lot of people are struggling with. So let's say I'm having difficulties balancing the low end. What I can do then is to solo the low end like this by simply clicking the band you want to solo. Now I'll be able to hear only the low frequencies. I can now compare the low end to my track to the low end in the reference track. This allows me to focus in on the very fine details in the various bands without being distracted by everything else that goes on in the mix. Regarding the low end, keep in mind that most studio monitors can't reproduce frequencies much lower than 50 Hz. There might be a lot going on down there that you simply can't hear. If you have a subwoofer, then this would be a good time to turn it on so that you can check for problems in the low end. The human ear is not very sensitive to these low frequencies, but we will be able to feel them, so a subwoofer can really come in handy in this situation. We can do the same thing with the other bands. If there's too much or too little energy in the high end, for example, it will be quite easy to tell using this method. Add or delete bands by holding Control and clicking. Adjusting the bands are easy. Just click here to move them around. I recommend checking your mix against not just one, but several reference tracks in order to be sure. It can also be useful to place a spectrum analyzer after the reference plugin. That way you can clearly see how the various frequencies in your track behave compared to the professional track. This doesn't look too bad. Perhaps the bass should be a little bit louder. You can use this method to analyze professional tracks and then figure out how levels are set for the various elements in your mix. It gives you a more objective way of looking at your own mix when you have something to compare it to. I'm including the link for this plugin in the description below in case you want to check it out. It has a 15-day trial, so you can check it out and determine for yourself if you like it or not. I'd like to thank our Patreons who help make these videos possible. I hope you like this video, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't done so already. And as always, if there's any specific tutorial you'd like me to make or you have a question, just let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.